So today we're talking about Batman and the supernatural, which I feel are two things that don't really get talked about enough together. People love to talk about Batman and people love to talk about the supernatural, but you put them together and people don't like talking about them so much, even though Batman has a rich history of fighting the supernatural. And so with this video, I wanted to talk about his history of fighting supernatural creatures. I wanted to talk about why I think people don't focus on it so much. And ultimately, I wanted to argue that it still has a place in Batman comics in the year 2025. Batman, I think, is one of the most malleable characters in all of fiction. One of the earliest video essays I did was over this topic, and basically it was over the idea that Batman will never die, and the reason why is because you can mold him to suit your needs. If you want a super cartoony Adam West type Batman, you can do that. If you want an ultra realistic Robert Pattinson type Batman or whatever, then you can do that. And so I think you've seen this with comics a lot over the years, where basically they take Batman in many different directions. And as I'm talking about, one of the directions is the supernatural. Going all the way back to the golden age of comics, right from the very beginning of things, Batman was fighting the supernatural. And this was during a period when they hadn't quite figured out all his rules. And so there's a very famous series of panels that shows Batman murdering Dracula in his crypt. And it's noteworthy that the original Batman comics didn't feature only the supernatural, right? That's where you get guys like the Joker and Catwoman and the Riddler and Scarecrow, stuff like that. And so the supernatural was not this overwhelming force in early Batman comics, but rather it was something that was still there. In the 80s also, I think you saw a lot of Batman comics featuring the occult. In Batman Gothic by Grant Morrison and Claus Janson, Batman comes up against a corrupted priest named Mr. Whisper who sold his soul to the devil in exchange for immortality for a set number of years. Grant Morrison's Arkham Asylum has a couple references to the occult. In Peter Milligan's Dark Knight, Dark City, it's hinted that Riddler is basically being possessed by a demon, and he makes Batman do a series of different tasks, which are all part of him summoning the demon Barbados. And that comic reveals that the demon Barbados, its spirit, got trapped there 300 years ago during a ritual involving one of Bruce Wayne's ancestors, Thomas Wayne, who we'll get to in a second. And so basically Batman helps to release the spirit of that demon. Batman was also featured in Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run in the 80s. Swamp Thing fights a lot of supernatural creatures. He would also be featured in The Sandman, which is about a mystical being. You also have such forces as the Lazarus Pit that Ra's al Ghul is often dunked into, I guess. Long story short, it can bring people back to life or it can de-age them. In addition to this, Batman works with Wonder Woman all the time, who literally fights Greek gods on a daily basis. In Grant Morrison's Batman run during the 2000s and early 2010s features a lot of supernatural stuff. As I mentioned in the story Dark Knight, Dark City, Peter Milligan reveals that Thomas Wayne, one of Bruce Wayne's ancestors, not his dad, but Thomas Wayne from like the 1700s, was involved in black magic rituals. And Grant Morrison basically swooped up that character and turned him into Dr. Hurt. Dr. Hurt is the major antagonist for the first 2/3 of Grant Morrison's Batman run, and basically Dr. Hurt says stuff like he is the devil, or he says that he is literally Bruce Wayne's father, and he's very much focused on demons, and he surrounds himself with guys who are named based on demons, and I don't know if they're actually demons. But regardless, he's certainly someone who appears to have demonic powers and seeks to destroy Batman's life. Grant Morrison kind of twisted this onto its head by the end of the run, and it's sort of revealed that the demon Barbados from Dark Knight, Dark City, if I'm understanding this correctly, and I'm not convinced that I am, but I believe that demon is actually revealed to be Darkseid's Omega adapter that was sent through time to try to kill Batman. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. I barely know what it means. And so it may not have been a demon that Thomas Wayne was touched by, but rather just a science fiction entity. And I do think you have a lot of religious stuff in Batman. So for instance, you have the Order of Saint Dumas, and that's who trained Azrael, but the Order of Saint Dumas is not necessarily a supernatural sect so much as it is just a weird terrorist cell. In Batman the Knight, which only came out a couple years ago, he meets Zatanna, who is a magician, and he trains with her father Zatara, and they fight a demon together. You have the Batman vs. Dracula movie from several years ago, from like 2 decades ago, that I really liked as a kid. You have the famous Batman vampire books from the 90s, wherein Batman gets turned into a vampire himself. And both of these last 2 examples of him fighting Dracula are kind of out of continuity, but at the same time, it's really confusing what is or isn't in continuity at this point. And what I mean by that is that DC has just kind of said that everything is in continuity, but the issue is that there's a lot of conflicting stuff. You can't have everything be canon if it doesn't add up, but regardless, everything is canon, and so everything I'm talking about here is canon. But all in all, as I'm trying to illustrate, Batman has a long history of fighting supernatural beings, whether they be vampires or werewolves, or the devil or witches. Batman, despite being a man in a bat costume, ultimately goes up against these creatures. And so in light of all this, I have to ask the question, why don't we talk about Batman and the supernatural more? Because really, we tend to focus on just guys that Batman fights. We tend to focus on people like Harley Quinn or the Riddler or the Joker or Bane, people who don't have any supernatural powers and maybe people without even powers to begin with. And so I feel like we often ignore the supernatural in Batman comics, and so I have to ask the question, why? There are a few different reasons I feel like the supernatural is oftentimes ignored in Batman comics. Number one, people tend to prefer a realistic Batman at this point in time. I think that movie series like the Christopher Nolan films or Robert Pattinson's Batman, I think that a lot of comics like Batman the Imposter, which was recommended to me by a viewer and which I loved, these are the kinds of examples of Batman that exists in the current popular imagination. I think people really love the idea of Batman being just a guy who fights other guys. And so I think that's really a major component of why the supernatural is oftentimes ignored, because it seems too extreme, it seems too comic booky for a lot of people, it seems too stupid. And so as a result, I do think that people tend to prefer a more realistic Batman, even though there's nothing realistic about a billionaire flying around Gotham City fighting dudes in a cape. But also I do think that as Batman comics have dealt with more serious topics over the years, I feel like that has pushed the supernatural off to the side. And so what I mean by that is that really there are a lot of dark Batman comics that came out in the 80s and 90s. In The Killing Joke, for instance, Barbara Gordon gets shot and loses the ability to walk. In Death of the Family, Jason Todd gets beaten to death and blown up. In Knightfall, Batman's back gets broken and he's out of the game for a year. And so all of these are real world serious topics. And even going back to Batman's origin story, it's him watching his parents get shot in an alleyway. And so I do think that if you're trying to deal with serious physical injuries and trauma and that sort of thing, I think that having a random ghost pop up can seem too silly. And so I do think that tonally, Batman comics have shied away from the supernatural for a number of years just because of that. But also I don't really think it makes sense within the broader context of the DC universe. And this is really where you have to suspend your disbelief. Because the fact of the matter is that like Batman knows Wonder Woman and he knows Zatanna and he knows all of these characters who are involved with magic. And so as a result, I do think that there are any number of deaths or injuries or traumas suffered that could be reversed with magic. But that doesn't really make for great storytelling if you have someone die and then they come back due to magic. But in addition to that, I think there are certain aspects to the way that Batman has been written that only makes sense if you ignore the supernatural. So for instance, in a fairly recent Batman comic written by Tom King, Batman says that he doesn't believe in God. This doesn't make sense, like just straight up, like this does not make sense. And the reason this doesn't make sense is because God is a character in DC Comics. God has appeared in DC Comics. And so it's not a matter of like belief. So for instance, Batman has interacted with Morpheus, Lord of Dreams, and Morpheus has interacted with Lucifer, the fallen angel from the Bible, and Lucifer has interacted with God. And so Batman is literally like two guys away from God. And so it doesn't make sense for him to say that he doesn't believe in God whenever he can just like ask a buddy, hey, have you met God? And then the buddy will go, oh no, I haven't, but I know a guy who has. Like it doesn't, there's just something there that doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense within the broader context of the DC universe. And so in order for that comment that Batman doesn't believe in God to make any sense, you basically have to ignore like half of the DC universe. And I think that's what a lot of people are content to do, quite frankly. I think that for the most part, people are pretty content when it comes to just Batman fighting killers, and I think that's cool. Recently, I just made a video about Batman the Black Mirror, and that's what that book is, and I think it's freaking great. I think that book's fantastic for a number of reasons, but a large one is just due to the fact that it is able to stay grounded and real, true to life. And I do think there is an element to the supernatural where it's like if you have Batman start fighting like witches who are putting magic hexes on him, and if you have him start fighting the devil on a regular basis and teaming up with John Constantine all the time, it's just going to be weird, and it's going to ultimately stray Batman away from the way that he's been written for the past, 20 or however many years. Also, I think there's only so many Batman comics that you could have about him like outwitting the devil before it just gets boring, because I think we kind of hold supernatural entities like that to a higher standard than we do someone human like Scarecrow, who sucks. And also, if I'm being completely honest, I think Spider-Man kind of ruined the supernatural for everyone when he sold his marriage to the devil, and that's a very real thing. In the comic books, during Civil War, he revealed his identity to the world, and then he immediately regretted it. And so in exchange for the devil making everyone in the world forget who he was, and also healing his Aunt May's gunshot wound, in exchange for these things, the devil took Peter Parker's marriage and unborn child. And that's gotta be one of the worst freaking trades of all time. And this happened 20 years ago in the comics, and One More Day has never been undone. So as a result, I think it's kind of a meme now to be like, yeah, Spider-Man sold his marriage to the devil. And it's a meme to make fun of it. And so I think that kind of ruined the devil for everyone. And that sounds really stupid, but I think ultimately there's probably some truth to it. I think ultimately making a story about the devil has become a lot harder to do after that. So thank you, Spider-Man, for ruining the supernatural for everyone. So as it currently stands, the supernatural just kind of stays in its own corner, I feel. Aside from a handful of instances, it feels like characters who are supernatural stay in their supernatural lanes, and that's it. In DC Comics, you do have Justice League Dark, which is a Justice League team specifically designed for fighting supernatural creatures. And you do have characters like Swamp Thing or John Constantine who fight supernatural threats all the time, and that's kind of their thing. And so I wonder if that's part of the reason why Batman doesn't fight the supernatural so often. In essence, that has kind of been pushed over to other characters, even though he was killing Dracula way before anyone else was even a thought. But all in all, it's just kind of sad to me that we are ignoring some of Batman's more fantastical elements, particularly because I love a more gothic Batman. He's a guy who dresses like a bat, and so I just really love that stylized, extreme version of him with a giant cape and with giant ears. And it feels right for that version of Batman to be fighting supernatural foes. And so whenever I talk about Batman and the supernatural, I'm not saying that Christian Bale should have been out here fighting Dracula. That's not what I'm saying. But rather, when it comes to the comic books, I do prefer a more fantastical Batman, I think. And it's just a matter of taste, really. It's just a matter of what you like. And I think certainly it's easier to do a more supernatural Batman whenever supernatural stuff is being discussed in the world at large. As I mentioned, I feel like a lot of the examples of supernatural stuff I can come up with comes from the 80s. And during that time, you had the Satanic Panic, and I think the US as a whole was a lot more religious. And so in the year 2025, whenever people aren't so religious, whenever people aren't worried about Satan taking away your soul, it's just not as easy to do a good Batman story with the supernatural, I think. I think it's possible, but again, I think that people are going to have a harder time getting into it or liking it or enjoying it. And ultimately, I do think that people at this point in time are preferring a more militarized Batman. People want something that is more true to life. People want him to have military weapons, and they like the giant Batmobile that is actually a tank. And it's cool and it's fun, and I'm not saying it's bad because it's not. But what I am saying is that I love Batman fighting serial killers who sold their soul to the devil many years ago. I like Batman fighting witches and vampires and werewolves, and I think it's kind of fun. Though certainly I think that in order to pull it off, in order to be a writer who writes a really good Batman story that's supernatural, I think that you have to be interested in it yourself. And as I'm saying, I don't think most people are interested in that. But by and large, it really does feel like, at least for the foreseeable future, we're not going to see too many big interactions between Batman and the supernatural, which makes my little vampire heart sad. So anyways, this is what I got. If you have any favorite supernatural Batman stories that I haven't talked about, please let me know what they are, because I would love to check them out. So thank you for watching. Have a nice night, and goodbye.